In the summer of 1979 in Eugene, Oregon, the Collins family lived a life that looked, from the outside, stable and predictable. Daniel Collins worked as a civil engineer for a regional firm, spending long hours managing infrastructure projects across Lane County. Rachel Collins taught second grade at a public elementary school, known among parents for her patience and consistency. Their home sat in a quiet residential area not far from Fern Ridge Lake, a place where families often spent weekends camping, fishing, and letting their children run freely in open space that felt safe by design. Ava, Chloe, Madison, and Harper Collins were identical quadruplets, all 6 years old, all enrolled at the same school where their mother worked. They were known in the community not only because of how strikingly similar they looked, but because of how inseparable they were. Teachers described them as attentive, curious, and unusually synchronized in the way they learned and interacted. Their names were often spoken together, as if separating them required effort no one ever made. To Rachel, each child had a distinct personality. To everyone else, they appeared as a single unit moving through early childhood with a kind of quiet cohesion. On a Saturday in late July, the family drove out to a designated camping area near the lake. It was not a special trip, not a celebration, not a departure from routine. It was the kind of ordinary weekend that blends into memory until something fractures it. Other families were present that day, setting up tents, preparing food, letting children move between groups without strict supervision. It was the kind of environment where familiarity replaced caution. At some point in the afternoon, the four girls were no longer within sight. There was no clear moment when absence replaced presence. There was no single realization that marked the beginning of the crisis. It unfolded gradually, then all at once. Rachel called their names and expected immediate answers the way she always had. When there was no response, she assumed they had moved behind another group of campers. Daniel expanded the search radius, first calmly, then with increasing urgency. Within an hour, the situation shifted from concern to alarm. Nearby families were asked if they had seen 4 identical girls. No one had noticed anything unusual. There were no reports of strangers, no sounds that stood out, no indication of disturbance. The campground, which had felt open and communal, now felt fragmented and unreliable. The absence of witnesses created a silence that was more unsettling than any direct threat. Local law enforcement was notified before evening. Search teams were assembled quickly, drawing from county resources and volunteer groups. The initial assumption centered on the possibility that the children had wandered too far and become disoriented. Search patterns were mapped, areas were divided, and teams moved systematically through terrain that had, hours earlier, been considered harmless. As night approached, the operational tone shifted. The absence of physical evidence, no footprints, no discarded items, no signs of struggle, introduced a second possibility that investigators were reluctant to state openly but could not ignore. The scale of the search expanded beyond the immediate area. Checkpoints were set up on nearby roads. Vehicles that had been present at the campsite were identified and, where possible, traced. Rachel remained at the command post that had been established near the entrance to the campground. She provided repeated descriptions of her daughters, emphasizing not only their identical appearance, but the specific details that differentiated them. Daniel coordinated with officers, answering procedural questions, reviewing timelines, attempting to reconstruct a sequence of events that had no clear beginning or end. By the second day, media coverage had begun. Local news outlets framed the disappearance as urgent and unprecedented. The image of 4 identical 6-year-old girls missing without a trace captured attention quickly, extending beyond Oregon into neighboring states. Tips began to come in, most of them inconsistent or unverifiable. Each lead required time, and each dead end reinforced the absence of a central narrative. Weeks passed without resolution. Search efforts continued but shifted in intensity and focus. Specialized units were brought in. Behavioral analysts reviewed the case. The possibility of abduction became the dominant theory, not because of evidence that confirmed it, but because no alternative explanation accounted for the complete lack of trace. Investigators reviewed individuals who had prior contact with the family, including school personnel and community members. Among those questioned was a former elementary school science teacher named Victor Hale, who had taught at the school the girls attended. At the time, his connection did not produce actionable findings. As months turned into years, the case entered a different phase. Active search operations were reduced. The file remained open but moved into a category that depended on new information rather than ongoing fieldwork. For the Collins family, there was no equivalent transition. The absence remained active, present in every routine, embedded in every decision about what to keep unchanged. Rachel continued teaching. Daniel continued working. Their home remained configured for 6 people. The bedrooms of the 4 girls were left intact, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a refusal to finalize an outcome that had never been confirmed. Birthdays passed without celebration. Holidays were observed with adjustments that no one outside the family fully understood. By 1990, the case had been officially classified as cold. The designation did not reflect closure. It reflected the limits of available evidence. Law enforcement agencies maintained the file, but the expectation of resolution diminished with each passing year. For the Collins family, the timeline did not move forward in a conventional sense. It remained anchored to a single day in 1979, with every subsequent year measured not by events, but by absence. 13 years after the disappearance, there was still no confirmed sighting, no verified lead, no explanation that could be accepted as fact. The names Ava, Chloe, Madison, and Harper Collins remained on record, unchanged, unaccounted for, and unresolved within a system that had exhausted its initial capacity to find them. By 1992, Rachel Collins had learned how to move through life with a version of stability that never fully held. The routines remained intact: teaching, grading, attending school meetings, but every structure in her life had been reshaped by absence. The years since 1979 had not resolved anything. They had only layered time over a single unresolved event. The case file had been labeled cold, but for Rachel, nothing about it had cooled. It remained active in memory, active in habit, active in the way she measured every passing year. The trip to Boise, Idaho, had not been planned with any connection to the past. It was a professional development conference for educators, something she had postponed for years. Daniel encouraged her to go, not because he believed it would change anything, but because he understood the weight of staying in the same place for too long. Boise was manageable, structured, temporary. It offered distance without requiring emotional risk. On the second day of the conference, Rachel chose to visit a local farmer's market that had been recommended by other attendees. It was described as a place where small producers showcased regional goods, honey, herbs, handmade products. The suggestion felt neutral, almost irrelevant, which was part of its appeal. She expected nothing beyond distraction. The stall that interrupted that expectation was positioned among other vendors offering similar items. A simple sign identified it as Four Sisters Farm. The name did not register immediately as significant. It was common enough, generic enough to pass unnoticed. What held her attention was the presence of 4 young women behind the table. They appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s. Their features were nearly identical, with only minor variations that required close observation to distinguish. The symmetry was not just physical. Their manner of presenting the products, their alignment behind the table, the consistency in how they interacted with customers. Everything suggested a shared pattern that went beyond coincidence. Rachel did not approach at first. She observed from a distance, allowing time to separate initial impression from assumption. The longer she watched, the more specific the recognition became. It was not a single detail that triggered it, but a convergence of small, precise elements. The angle of a smile that felt familiar. The way attention shifted from one task to another with a kind of quiet coordination. The absence of hesitation in movement, replaced by a learned efficiency. When she moved closer, the products themselves, jars of honey, bundles of dried lavender, became secondary. What mattered were the identifiers that could not be explained easily. One of the young women turned slightly, revealing a small, faint mark along the side of her neck. Rachel registered it immediately, not as something newly observed, but as something remembered. The introduction came through routine interaction. Names were offered as part of the exchange without emphasis, without awareness of their impact. Ava, Chloe, Madison, Harper. The sequence was delivered in a way that suggested it had been repeated countless times in similar contexts. For Rachel, the effect was immediate and destabilizing. The names alone could have been dismissed as coincidence. They were not uncommon, and their repetition in different families was statistically possible. But combined with the physical resemblance and the specific details she had already noted, they formed a pattern that resisted dismissal. She completed a transaction she did not fully process, purchasing items she did not intend to buy. The exchange allowed her to remain at the stall longer without drawing attention. It also gave her a reason to listen more closely. The information offered by the young women followed a consistent narrative. They operated a family farm. They had grown up together in a rural area outside Boise. Their father had taught them everything they knew about agriculture. The language was simple, direct, and aligned across all four individuals. There was no reference to a mother, no mention of extended family, no indication of formal education beyond what could be inferred from their speech. The narrative was contained, complete within itself, and closed to external context. Rachel returned to her hotel room with a level of certainty she had not experienced in over a decade. It was not certainty in the sense of proof. It was certainty in the sense that the probability of coincidence had been exceeded. The convergence of names, appearance, and behavioral detail created a scenario that required investigation. She contacted Daniel that evening. The conversation was structured, controlled, focused on facts rather than interpretation. She described what she had seen, emphasizing the elements that could be verified. Daniel listened without interruption, asking questions that narrowed the scope of speculation. The goal was not to confirm belief, but to establish a basis for action. The name Victor Hale surfaced quickly in their discussion. During the initial investigation in 1979, Hale had been one of several individuals connected to the school system who had been interviewed. At the time, nothing had tied him directly to the disappearance. His profile had not matched the primary working theories. He had relocated within a year of the incident, which had been noted but not pursued beyond standard procedure. Rachel began reviewing local records the following day. Public information about agricultural operations in the Boise area was accessible through county listings and archived materials. It did not take long to identify a property registered under the name Hale Family Farm, established in 1980. The timing aligned closely with the period following the disappearance. Further records indicated that Victor Hale had reported taking in 4 young girls, described as orphans from an unspecified accident. The documentation was minimal. There were no detailed reports, no external verification of the event, and no formal adoption records readily available through standard channels. The narrative presented in those records mirrored what Rachel had heard at the market. It was consistent, self-contained, and unsupported by independent confirmation. The absence of official documentation was not definitive proof of wrongdoing, but in the context of the Collins case, it carried weight. Daniel arrived in Boise within 24 hours. The decision to proceed was not framed as a choice between options, but as a continuation of a process that had never fully ended. The objective was clear: verify identity, establish connection, and determine whether the 4 young women operating under the name First Sisters Farm were, in fact, Ava, Chloe, Madison, and Harper Collins. Daniel Collins arrived in Boise with a clear objective and a controlled sense of urgency that had been refined over 13 years of unresolved searching. The information Rachel had gathered was organized, chronological, and stripped of interpretation. That discipline was intentional. In cases where emotion could distort judgment, both of them had learned to rely on verifiable sequences rather than instinct alone. What Rachel had seen at the farmer's market was not treated as proof, but it had already exceeded the threshold of coincidence. The first step was confirmation of identity through indirect observation. They returned to the market the following morning, positioning themselves in a way that allowed for extended monitoring without interaction. The 4 young women reappeared at the same stall, operating under the same name, maintaining the same pattern of presentation. The consistency reinforced the reliability of what Rachel had reported. Nothing about their behavior suggested awareness of being observed. Nothing indicated external supervision within the visible space. However, the absence of visible control did not negate the possibility of structured oversight beyond immediate proximity. Daniel documented details systematically. Physical markers were noted, including the distinguishing feature Rachel had identified. Behavioral patterns were recorded, focusing on timing, coordination, and the distribution of tasks among the 4 individuals. Their interaction with customers followed a predictable structure, suggesting repetition rather than improvisation. The narrative they provided about their background remained consistent across multiple exchanges with different people. There were no deviations, no contradictions, no spontaneous additions that might indicate a broader, more complex history. Rachel focused on elements that could not be easily replicated or learned. Subtle expressions, patterns of attention, and the internal rhythm of how the 4 moved through shared tasks. These were not definitive indicators on their own, but in combination with the known facts from 1979, they formed a composite that aligned too closely to ignore. After several hours, Daniel made the decision to shift from observation to data acquisition. Direct engagement was necessary, but it had to be controlled. The risk was not only misidentification, but also the possibility of alerting whoever was responsible for maintaining the current situation. If Victor Hale was involved, any indication that his past actions were being revisited could trigger a response that would complicate further investigation. Rachel approached the stall alone. The interaction was structured around ordinary consumer behavior. She asked about the products, the origin of the honey, the process of cultivation. The responses were consistent with what had been observed the previous day. The 4 young women presented a unified account of their upbringing on a family farm outside Boise. The language used was simple, direct, and repeated across individuals without variation. There was no reference to any life prior to that environment. Rachel introduced elements that tested the boundaries of that narrative. Questions about early childhood, schooling, and community involvement were answered in ways that redirected focus back to the farm. The absence of specific detail regarding early years was notable. It was not framed as avoidance, but as limitation. Their history appeared to begin at the point where the farm became central. During the interaction, Rachel introduced a controlled reference to memory without providing context. The reaction was immediate and measurable. One of the 4 paused in a way that disrupted the established pattern of response. The others maintained continuity, but the disruption was enough to indicate that the question had reached beyond the surface narrative. There was no overt expression of recognition, but there was a shift that suggested the presence of suppressed or inaccessible information. Rachel did not pursue the line of questioning further. The objective was not to force recognition in that moment, but to confirm that such recognition was possible. She concluded the interaction without escalation, returning to Daniel with a set of observations that altered the assessment of the situation. The next phase involved verification through external records. Daniel accessed county property data, confirming the existence of Hale Family Farm approximately 40 miles outside Boise. The property had been acquired in 1980 under the name Victor Hale. There were no indications of co-ownership, no record of a spouse, and no documentation linking the property to any extended family structure. Further inquiry into adoption records produced no formal documentation corresponding to the claim that Hale had legally taken in 4 children. In the United States, adoption processes generate extensive legal records, including court filings, background checks, and official decrees. The absence of such records did not automatically indicate illegality, but it significantly reduced the likelihood that the situation was legitimate. Daniel cross-referenced the timeline with the Collins case. The disappearance occurred in mid-1979. Hale's relocation and acquisition of the farm occurred within the following year. The introduction of 4 children into his household was documented informally around the same period. The alignment was precise enough to warrant escalation. Rachel returned to the market for a second controlled interaction. This time, the approach included a more direct reference to shared experience, framed in a way that would not immediately expose the underlying intent. The response from one of the four included a brief hesitation followed by a return to the standard narrative. The hesitation was subtle, but consistent with the earlier disruption. The conclusion was no longer tentative. The probability that the four young women were the missing Collins quadruplets had increased to a level that required formal intervention. The remaining question was not whether to act, but how to act without causing unintended harm. Daniel and Rachel evaluated their options. Direct confrontation was rejected. The psychological condition of the four individuals was unknown, and any attempt to assert an alternative identity without support could produce resistance or distress. The possibility that they had been raised to distrust external authority was considered likely. If that was the case, any unsupervised attempt to intervene could reinforce existing control mechanisms. They agreed on a coordinated approach involving law enforcement. The information they had gathered, visual confirmation, behavioral analysis, property records, and timeline alignment, was compiled into a structured report. The goal was to present a case that could be acted upon within legal parameters, minimizing delay while ensuring procedural accuracy. Before contacting authorities, Daniel conducted one final review of the data. Every element was examined for consistency. Every assumption was tested against available facts. The objective was to eliminate uncertainty to the extent possible before transferring responsibility to an external agency. Rachel's role shifted from observer to primary witness. Her identification of specific physical markers and behavioral traits provided a direct link between the present and the past. Her account was not framed as belief, but as recognition supported by detail. The decision to proceed was made without further delay. The next step would move the situation out of private control and into a system designed to handle cases that had remained unresolved for over a decade. The implications of that transition were understood. Once initiated, it would not be reversible, and the outcome would extend beyond the recovery of identity into the reconstruction of lives that had been shaped by 13 years of controlled reality. Daniel and Rachel Collins moved into the next phase with a level of restraint that had taken years to develop. After contacting local law enforcement in Idaho, they were directed through a process that required them to present everything in structured form. The officers who first received the report treated it as a potential identity claim tied to a cold case, not yet as a confirmed abduction. That distinction mattered. It meant every detail had to be documented, every connection had to be justified, and every assumption had to be separated from evidence. Rachel provided her account in a controlled sequence, focusing on what she had observed rather than what she believed. She described the physical similarities, the specific identifying mark, and the repetition of names. She outlined the behavioral patterns she had recognized, emphasizing elements that could not be easily fabricated or coincidentally matched. Daniel supplemented her account with the data he had collected. The property records linking Victor Hale to a farm established in 1980, the absence of formal adoption documentation, and the alignment of timelines between Hale's relocation and the disappearance of the Collins children. The initial response from authorities was measured. Cases involving long-term missing persons required verification at multiple levels. The fact that 13 years had passed introduced additional complexity. The individuals in question were now adults with established identities, however constructed. Any intervention would need to account not only for potential criminal activity but also for the psychological condition of those involved. A detective assigned to the case began reviewing the Collins file from Oregon alongside the information provided in Idaho. The connection to Victor Hale, which had once been peripheral, now took on greater significance. Hale's prior role as a science teacher placed him in direct proximity to the Collins family during the period leading up to the disappearance. His relocation within a year of the event, combined with the undocumented appearance of 4 children in his care, created a sequence that demanded closer examination. Rachel and Daniel were advised not to make further direct contact with the 4 young women. The risk of alerting Hale was considered high. If he had maintained control over them for 13 years, any indication that his actions were under scrutiny could trigger a response designed to reinforce that control or remove the individuals from public access entirely. The situation required surveillance, coordination, and timing. Law enforcement began by confirming the operational patterns of Hale family farm. Market schedules, transportation routines, and supply chains were analyzed to determine when and how the four women moved outside the property. It became clear that their appearances in public were limited and structured. They attended select markets, remained within defined timeframes, and returned directly to the farm. There was no evidence of independent activity beyond those intervals. Rachel's observations about behavioral consistency were corroborated by officers who conducted discreet surveillance at the market. The four women operated as a unit, rarely deviating from established roles. Their communication with each other was efficient but minimal, focused on task execution rather than spontaneous interaction. There was no visible sign of external monitoring at the market, but the precision of their routine suggested oversight at another level. The decision was made to extend surveillance to the farm itself. Officers positioned at a distance documented movement patterns over several days. Victor Hale appeared regularly within the operational structure, directing activity and maintaining a consistent presence. There were no additional individuals observed living on the property. Deliveries were infrequent and handled without prolonged interaction. Rachel and Daniel were not present during these observations, but they were kept informed through controlled briefings. The information confirmed what they had already concluded. The four young women were living within a closed system that limited external contact and maintained a singular narrative about their identity. At this stage, the case shifted from verification to strategy. The primary objective was to establish legal grounds for intervention. Without formal documentation of adoption, and with a timeline that aligned with an unsolved abduction, the threshold for probable cause was approaching. However, authorities needed a direct link, something that could move the case from strong suspicion to actionable evidence. Rachel's earlier interaction at the market became critical. Her ability to identify specific features and behavioral traits provided a basis for requesting further investigative measures. DNA comparison was identified as the most definitive method of confirmation. The challenge was obtaining a sample without alerting Hale or causing distress to the individuals involved. A plan was developed to collect biological material during the next market appearance. The approach relied on standard procedures used in long-term identification cases. Items handled by the four women, containers, packaging, or disposable materials could potentially yield viable samples. The process required precision and discretion, ensuring that the collection did not interfere with the operation of the market or draw attention. Rachel was informed of the plan but was not directly involved in its execution. Her role remained that of primary witness and identifier. Daniel focused on maintaining communication with the investigative team, ensuring that all information continued to flow in a structured and accurate manner. During the next scheduled market appearance, officers integrated into the environment in plain clothes. Their objective was not engagement but observation and collection. The four women arrived according to the established pattern, set up their stall, and began operating without deviation. The consistency of their behavior reinforced the assessment that their actions were governed by routine rather than independent choice. The collection process was completed without incident. Items that had been in direct contact with the four individuals were secured and sent for analysis. The waiting period that followed introduced a different kind of tension. For the first time in 13 years, Rachel and Daniel were not searching blindly. They were waiting for confirmation that would either validate everything they had believed or collapse it entirely. At the same time, surveillance on the farm continued. Victor Hale's movements remained consistent, but there were subtle shifts that suggested awareness at some level. The timing of departures and returns became slightly less predictable. The duration of market visits shortened marginally. These changes were not definitive, but they indicated that the environment was no longer static. The investigative team accelerated its timeline. If Hale had become aware of increased attention, the risk of relocation or further isolation increased. The need to act before that possibility materialized became central to the strategy. Rachel understood that the next phase would move beyond observation into direct intervention. The implications were clear. If the DNA results confirmed the identities, the situation would transition from investigation to recovery. That transition would not be simple. The four individuals had lived under a constructed identity for most of their lives. The introduction of a conflicting reality would not automatically result in acceptance. Daniel approached the situation from a legal standpoint. The absence of adoption records, combined with the potential confirmation of identity through DNA, would establish grounds for arrest. However, the recovery of the four women would require more than legal authority. It would require a process capable of addressing the psychological impact of sudden re-identification. As the results from the laboratory moved toward completion, every element of the case aligned toward a single outcome. The years of uncertainty were converging into a moment that would define what came next. Not only for Rachel and Daniel, but for four individuals whose entire understanding of themselves was about to be challenged. The report submitted by Daniel and Rachel Collins moved through the system faster than most cold cases ever did. The combination of a missing children case, a clear suspect with prior proximity, and the emergence of four individuals' matching names, age progression, and identifying traits created a convergence that law enforcement could not ignore. What had been dormant for 13 years was now active again, but under a different set of conditions. The individuals in question were no longer children. They were adults with an established identity, however constructed, and any intervention would have to account for that reality. The DNA samples collected at the market were processed under priority status. The request for expedited analysis was justified by the potential scale of the case and the risk that delay could result in loss of access. While the laboratory worked through the comparison, investigators continued building the operational framework for what would follow if the results confirmed identity. The Hale property became the focal point of planning. Surveillance data indicated a consistent pattern. The four women remained within the boundaries of the farm, except during scheduled market appearances. Victor Hale maintained a central role in directing activity, and no external support structure was identified. There were no employees, no extended family, and no regular visitors. The environment functioned as a closed system with Hale at its center. Rachel and Daniel were briefed on the implications of this structure. If the four women had spent 13 years within that system, their perception of authority, safety, and identity would likely be shaped by it. Intervention would not simply be a matter of removal. It would require a process that addressed psychological conditioning as much as physical separation. When the DNA results returned, they removed the final layer of uncertainty. The profiles matched. Ava, Chloe, Madison, and Harper Collins were alive and living under the identities presented at the market. The confirmation transformed the case from investigation into recovery and enforcement. A joint operation was assembled involving local law enforcement, state authorities, and federal agents. The objective was defined with precision: secure the four individuals, ensure their safety, and detain Victor Hale without escalation. The plan accounted for the possibility that the women might resist, not out of intent to obstruct justice, but because their understanding of the situation had been shaped by years of controlled information. Rachel's role in the operation was limited by design. She was positioned as a point of identification and support, not as a participant in the initial intervention. Daniel accepted the structure without resistance. Both understood that the success of the operation depended on discipline, not proximity. The approach to the property was timed to coincide with a period when all five individuals were present. Surveillance had established that the women were most consistently together during non-market days. The intention was to avoid fragmentation, ensuring that the four could be engaged simultaneously and reducing the risk of miscommunication or separation under stress. Initial contact was made through standard law enforcement procedure. Identification, declaration of purpose, and request for compliance were delivered in a controlled manner. The response from inside the structure did not follow the expected pattern of immediate compliance or confrontation. Instead, there was a delay, followed by the emergence of one of the four women. Her response indicated confusion rather than hostility. The language used reflected a framework in which external authority was perceived as a potential threat rather than a source of protection. References to family and safety were centered on Hale, not on any external structure. The other three appeared shortly after, aligning themselves within the same framework. Victor Hale's presence altered the dynamic immediately. His statements positioned the situation as an intrusion, framing law enforcement as an external force attempting to disrupt a stable environment. The narrative he presented was consistent with the one the women had repeated at the market. He emphasized protection, stability, and the legitimacy of their current identity. The agents leading the operation maintained focus on the objective. They introduced the concept of verification, not accusation. The existence of DNA evidence, historical records, and prior investigation was presented as a basis for further examination rather than immediate judgment. This approach was intentional. It created space for the four women to process information without forcing an immediate shift in allegiance. Rachel was brought forward only after initial contact had established a controlled environment. Her presence introduced a variable that could not be replicated by any procedural element. Recognition, if it occurred, would not be the result of argument or evidence alone. It would emerge, if at all, from the intersection of memory and identity. The first moments of that encounter did not produce immediate resolution. The four women did not move toward Rachel with certainty or rejection. Instead, their response reflected a conflict that had no simple expression. The identity they had lived with for 13 years did not dissolve in the presence of new information. It resisted not through defiance, but through the weight of repetition. Agents introduced physical evidence in a measured sequence. Photographs from 1979 were presented alongside current images. The progression was designed to bridge the gap between past and present, not through explanation, but through visual continuity. The effect was incremental. Recognition did not appear as a single event, but as a series of small disruptions in the existing narrative. Victor Hale attempted to maintain control of the situation by reinforcing his version of events. His language shifted from explanation to insistence, from structure to urgency. The agents responded by narrowing the scope of engagement, focusing on the individuals rather than the narrative he presented. The moment of transition did not occur through confrontation. It emerged when one of the four identified a detail that had no place within the constructed history. A fragment of memory previously inaccessible, aligned with the evidence being presented. That alignment created a point of instability within the framework Hale had maintained. The others followed not simultaneously, but in sequence. Each recognition reinforced the next, creating a cumulative effect that altered the balance of the situation. The identity they had lived under did not disappear, but it was no longer exclusive. It existed alongside a second narrative that was supported by evidence and internal recall. Hale's authority diminished as that process unfolded. His attempts to reassert control became less effective as the four shifted their attention away from his narrative and toward the emerging reality presented by law enforcement and Rachel. The operation concluded without escalation. Hale was taken into custody under charges that had now been substantiated by both evidence and circumstance. The four women were separated from the environment that had defined their lives for 13 years and placed under protective care. For Rachel and Daniel, the outcome represented confirmation rather than resolution. The recovery of their daughters did not restore the years that had been lost. It initiated a new phase, one that would require reconstruction rather than discovery. The system that had hidden the truth had been dismantled, but the process of replacing it with something stable, something real, had only just begun. The transition from recovery to recognition did not follow a linear path. The confirmation of identity through DNA provided a definitive answer to the question that had remained unresolved since 1979, but it did not immediately translate into acceptance for the four young women now identified as Ava, Chloe, Madison, and Harper Collins. For 13 years, their understanding of themselves had been built on a single narrative. That narrative did not disappear simply because a second, more accurate one had been introduced. They were transferred into a controlled environment designed for evaluation and stabilization. The objective was not only to ensure physical safety, but to begin assessing the extent of psychological conditioning that had occurred under Victor Hale's influence. Specialists in long-term identity disruption cases were assigned to the process, including clinical psychologists, social workers, and legal advocates. Each interaction was structured to avoid overwhelming the individuals while gradually introducing verified information. Initial sessions focused on orientation. The four women were presented with the basic facts established through evidence: their legal names, their date of birth, the documented disappearance in 1979, and the confirmed DNA match to Rachel and Daniel Collins. The information was delivered without pressure to accept or respond. The approach recognized that cognitive acceptance and emotional integration operate on different timelines. Their responses reflected a complex internal conflict. The identity associated with Hale's narrative remained dominant in terms of familiarity and emotional association. References to him were framed in terms of protection and authority. The concept that this figure could also be the source of harm was not immediately accessible within their existing framework. At the same time, the introduction of verifiable data created a secondary structure that could not be dismissed entirely. Memory retrieval emerged gradually. It did not occur as a complete restoration, but as fragmented recollections that surfaced in response to specific triggers. Photographs from early childhood were used as part of the process. These images were not presented as proof alone, but as tools to access stored information that had been suppressed or disconnected. The effect varied across the four individuals. Recognition appeared in different forms, sometimes as familiarity without context, sometimes as a partial sequence that lacked continuity. Rachel's presence was reintroduced under controlled conditions. Her role was not to assert a relationship, but to provide a reference point that aligned with the emerging fragments of memory. The interactions were brief and structured. Emotional escalation was avoided. The objective was to allow recognition to develop internally rather than being imposed externally. In one of the early sessions, a specific detail altered the trajectory of the process. A reference to a routine from early childhood, an activity that had no relevance to the life on the farm, produced a measurable shift. The recognition was not immediate or complete, but it created a connection that had not existed before. That connection became a point of reference for subsequent sessions. The narrative constructed by Hale began to show inconsistencies when compared against both external evidence and internal recall. The claim that their biological parents had died was contradicted by the presence of Rachel and Daniel. The absence of formal documentation for adoption was introduced as a legal fact. The structure of their upbringing, which had excluded formal education and external contact, was reframed as a controlled environment rather than a protective one. The process did not frame Hale solely as an antagonist. The complexity of the situation required acknowledgement that the four women had experienced aspects of care within that environment. This acknowledgement was essential to avoid forcing a binary interpretation that could trigger resistance. Instead, the focus remained on the distinction between care and control, between support and restriction. As sessions continued, the recollection of the initial event in 1979 began to surface. The memory did not emerge as a continuous sequence. It appeared in segments that required contextualization. The four recalled being approached in a familiar context, not recognizing the interaction as a threat. The transition from that moment to separation from their family was reconstructed through guided recall, supported by investigative findings. The introduction of false information during that period became a central element of understanding. The narrative that their parents had died, reinforced through repeated statements and the absence of contradictory information, had been accepted as fact. Over time, it had replaced any competing memory, creating a stable but inaccurate foundation for identity. The role of isolation was analyzed as part of the conditioning process. The lack of external reference points prevented the introduction of alternative narratives. Education was limited to what Hale provided. Social interaction was restricted to the four individuals and Hale himself. Without exposure to external validation, the constructed identity remained unchallenged. Legal proceedings against Victor Hale progressed in parallel. The charges included kidnapping and identity manipulation, supported by both the original case file and the newly obtained evidence. The decision to proceed without requiring direct testimony from the four women was made to minimize additional psychological strain. Hale entered a plea that avoided a prolonged trial, resulting in a sentence that removed him permanently from their lives. For the four women, the conclusion of the legal process did not mark an endpoint. It removed the source of control, but it did not immediately replace the structure that had been built over 13 years. That structure had to be dismantled and reconstructed through a deliberate process. Rachel and Daniel were included in this process as participants rather than authorities. Their role was defined by presence, consistency, and the gradual reintroduction of a relationship that had been interrupted rather than ended. They did not attempt to reclaim lost time. They focused on establishing a foundation that could support future interaction. The concept of identity was addressed explicitly. The four were encouraged to understand that the names they had used and the roles they had performed were part of their history, but not the entirety of it. The integration of both narratives, what had been lived and what had been lost, became the central task. Progress was measured not in dramatic shifts, but in small, consistent changes. Recognition of personal history expanded incrementally. The use of their original names became more frequent, not as an obligation, but as a reflection of internal acceptance. References to Rachel and Daniel shifted over time, moving from formal acknowledgement to a more personal framework. The reconstruction of identity extended beyond memory. It included education, legal documentation, and the development of independent decision-making. The four women were introduced to systems that had been absent from their lives, including formal education pathways and healthcare structures. Each step required adjustment, as the assumptions that guided their previous experience did not align with the broader social environment. The process was neither uniform nor synchronized across the four. Each progressed at a different pace, influenced by individual disposition and the specific way in which memory had been stored and accessed. The shared experience provided a foundation, but it did not eliminate individual variation. What had been recovered was not simply four individuals, but four lives that had been diverted and were now being redirected. The past remained present, not as a fixed point, but as a component that required integration. The future, for the first time since 1979, was no longer defined by absence or control, but by the possibility of choice. The legal resolution of the case did not simplify what followed. Victor Hale's conviction removed the source of long-term control, but it did not erase the structure he had built over 13 years. For Ava, Chloe, Madison, and Harper Collins, the absence of that structure created a different kind of instability. The system that had dictated their daily lives, their decisions, and their understanding of the world was gone. What remained was not immediate freedom in the way it is often imagined, but an unstructured space that required rebuilding from the ground up. The recovery team shifted its focus from identification to long-term integration. The four women were no longer considered missing persons, but individuals in transition between two identities. Their progress depended on how effectively those identities could be reconciled rather than replaced. The process was structured, but it allowed for variation. Each of the four responded differently, influenced by personality traits that had persisted despite years of uniform conditioning. Ava demonstrated a tendency to organize and stabilize. During sessions, she focused on practical elements of adjustment, documentation, education, and future planning. Her responses suggested an effort to establish control in a way that did not depend on external authority. Chloe approached the situation through analysis. She asked questions about the legal process, the investigation, and the evidence that had led to Hale's conviction. Her engagement with facts provided a framework that allowed her to evaluate her own experience without relying solely on emotion. Madison's response was more internal. She processed information quietly, often requiring additional time to integrate new details. Her progress was measured not by verbal acknowledgement but by changes in behavior that indicated increasing acceptance of the reconstructed identity. Harper displayed the most immediate emotional fluctuation. Her responses shifted between attachment to the past structure and recognition of its limitations. This variation was not treated as resistance but as part of the process of disentangling long-term conditioning. The psychological team emphasized that no single response pattern was more valid than another. The objective was not to standardize their reactions but to support each individual in developing an independent framework of understanding. The shared history of the four created a bond that could not be separated, but the integration process required acknowledgement of individual differences. Education became a central component of reintegration. The four had received limited instruction under Hale's supervision, focused primarily on practical skills related to the farm. Formal education had been absent. The introduction of structured learning environments was approached gradually. Placement assessments were conducted to determine baseline knowledge in core areas. The results varied, reflecting both the limitations of their prior education and the adaptability they had developed. Programs were designed to bridge gaps without overwhelming them. Community college pathways were identified as a practical starting point, offering flexibility and access to support services. Ava expressed interest in agricultural science, not as a continuation of the past, but as a way to contextualize the skills she had developed within a legitimate framework. Chloe showed inclination toward social sciences, particularly psychology, as a means of understanding the mechanisms that had shaped their experience. Madison approached education with caution, preferring incremental engagement over immediate immersion. Harper's interest shifted between areas, reflecting an ongoing process of identity exploration. The variability was expected and accommodated. Progress was defined not by speed but by sustainability. Legal identity reconstruction required coordination across multiple agencies. Birth records, social security documentation, and educational history had to be reestablished. The absence of continuous records created administrative challenges, but the confirmed DNA match and the original case file provided a foundation. The process was complex, but it was essential. Without formal recognition of their identity, access to education, employment, and healthcare would remain limited. Rachel and Daniel participated in this phase with a level of restraint that had been shaped by the previous years. They did not attempt to impose a familial structure based on expectation. Instead, they engaged through consistent presence and availability. Their role was defined by reliability rather than authority. They attended scheduled sessions, provided information when requested, and allowed the four to determine the pace of interaction. The relationship between the parents and the four women evolved gradually. Initial interactions were formal, structured around the context of recovery and identification. Over time, the formality decreased, replaced by moments of recognition that did not require explanation. These moments were not dramatic. They appeared in small, specific ways, shared references, aligned reactions, and the gradual use of familial terms that had not been present before. The narrative surrounding Victor Hale remained complex. The four women did not immediately reinterpret him solely as a perpetrator. Their experience included elements of care that had been genuine within the context of control. The psychological team addressed this directly, emphasizing that acknowledging those elements did not negate the harm that had been done. The distinction between intention and impact became a critical component of their understanding. Group sessions allowed the four to process their shared experience collectively. The structure of these sessions encouraged them to articulate differences in perception, reinforcing the idea that their experiences, while connected, were not identical. This differentiation supported the development of individual identity within the context of a shared past. Over time, measurable changes occurred. The use of their original names became consistent across all four. References to Hale shifted from present tense association to past tense analysis. Their engagement with external systems, education, healthcare, legal processes became more autonomous. The need for constant guidance decreased as familiarity increased. The concept of future planning, which had been absent under Hale's control, began to take shape. The four started to articulate goals that extended beyond immediate recovery. These goals were not uniform. Ava focused on building a career connected to sustainable agriculture. Chloe pursued academic pathways that would allow her to engage with others who had experienced similar disruptions. Madison prioritized stability and gradual integration into broader social structures. Harper explored creative and interpersonal avenues, reflecting an effort to define identity beyond the constraints of the past. The process remained ongoing. There was no defined endpoint at which integration would be considered complete. Instead, progress was understood as a continuous adjustment to a reality that had been interrupted and was now being reconstructed. For Rachel and Daniel, the transformation was equally complex. The return of their daughters did not restore the family to its previous state. It required the creation of a new structure, one that acknowledged the years that had been lost without attempting to replicate them. Their role shifted from recovery to support, from searching to sustaining. The case that had once been defined by absence was now defined by presence, but that presence carried the weight of everything that had occurred in between. The resolution of the legal case had closed one chapter. The work of rebuilding identity, relationship, and future had only begun, shaped by the understanding that what had been taken could not be returned, but what remained could still be redefined. 2 years after the recovery, the Collins family no longer measured time by the day everything was lost. The reference point had shifted. The past remained fixed, but it no longer defined the present with the same intensity. What had once been an absence that controlled every decision had been replaced by a process that required patience, structure, and acceptance of limits. Ava, Chloe, Madison, and Harper were no longer identified primarily as victims in an open case. They had become individuals moving through a complex reconstruction of identity within a system that required documentation, consistency, and independent choice. Their legal identities had been fully restored. Educational pathways had been established. Access to healthcare and social systems had been normalized. These changes, while procedural on the surface, represented a fundamental shift in how they existed within society. The four did not return to a version of life that had been interrupted in 1979. That version no longer existed. Instead, they developed a structure that incorporated both what had been lost and what had been lived in the years between. The integration was not symmetrical. Each of them carried different aspects of the past into the present. Ava completed a certification program in sustainable agriculture, formalizing knowledge that had originally been acquired under constrained conditions. The difference now was not in the skill itself, but in the context. The work was no longer tied to obligation or control. It was connected to choice, to the ability to apply knowledge within a system that recognized her autonomy. Chloe continued her studies in psychology, focusing on trauma and long-term identity disruption. Her interest was not abstract. It was rooted in direct experience, but she approached it through academic structure. The process allowed her to translate personal history into a framework that could be understood, analyzed, and eventually used to support others navigating similar situations. Madison prioritized stability in a different way. She chose a path that emphasized consistency over expansion, working within environments that offered predictable structure. Her progress was not measured by external milestones but by the absence of instability. For her, integration meant reducing uncertainty rather than pursuing complexity. Harper's development remained the most fluid. She explored multiple directions, engaging with creative programs and community-based work. Her approach reflected an ongoing effort to define identity beyond categories that had been assigned or recovered. The lack of a fixed path was not treated as a deficit but as part of the process of establishing agency. Rachel and Daniel adjusted to roles that did not exist before. They were no longer searching, but they were not returning to a previous version of parenthood either. Their relationship with the four women was built on continuity rather than recovery. They participated in daily life where appropriate, provided support where needed, and accepted boundaries where they were established. Family interaction developed through routine rather than declaration. Shared activities emerged gradually, not as attempts to recreate the past, but as opportunities to establish new patterns. The connection between them was not dependent on constant affirmation. It was reinforced through consistency, through presence, and through the absence of the uncertainty that had defined the previous 13 years. The farm that had once been associated with control was not revisited. Instead, the four chose to create a separate space for applying their skills. A small agricultural project was developed with support from local programs. The scale was limited, but the significance was not. It represented the first time their work was conducted within a system that acknowledged their autonomy, their legal identity, and their right to define the conditions under which they operated. The project was not framed as a continuation of the past. It was structured as a new beginning, informed by experience but not constrained by it. The four managed the operation collectively, but with defined roles that reflected their individual preferences. Decision-making was shared but not uniform. The process itself became part of their integration, reinforcing the concept that control could be distributed rather than centralized. Public awareness of the case remained present, but it no longer dictated the course of their lives. Media attention diminished over time, replaced by a level of privacy that allowed for continued development without external pressure. The narrative that had once been defined by disappearance and recovery evolved into one of adjustment and reconstruction. There were still moments when the past reasserted itself. Memory does not follow a fixed timeline, and certain details emerged without warning. These moments were not treated as setbacks. They were acknowledged as part of a history that could not be removed. The difference now was that those memories existed within a broader context that included stability, support, and the ability to respond. Victor Hale's absence was permanent. His influence, however, required ongoing interpretation. The four did not erase the years they had lived under his control. They redefined them. The experience became part of their identity, but it did not determine its entirety. The distinction was essential. It allowed them to move forward without denying what had occurred. The Collins family, as it existed now, was not a restoration of what had been. It was a reconstruction built from fragments that had survived separation, distortion, and time. The process had no clear endpoint. It continued through everyday decisions, through the way relationships were maintained, and through the choices each individual made about their future. What remained constant was not the past, but the capacity to move beyond it. The years that had been taken could not be returned. The identities that had been altered could not be restored to their original state. But the ability to define what came next had not been taken permanently. It had been delayed, constrained, and redirected, but it remained. In the end, the Collins family did not find closure in the way it is often described. There was no moment that resolved everything that had been lost. Instead, there was a gradual shift towards something more durable, an understanding that healing is not the recovery of what once existed, but the creation of something new from what remains. And in that process, the most important truth did not come from the investigation, the evidence, or the legal outcome. It came from the realization that identity is not defined solely by what is taken away, but by what is chosen afterward. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to today's story. Your attention, your patience, and your willingness to stay until the very end truly mean more than words can fully express. In a world where everything moves quickly, choosing to pause and reflect on a story like this is something we deeply appreciate. From this story, one of the most important lessons we can take away is that life does not always unfold the way we expect, but resilience and truth have a way of finding their path back. Even after years of loss, confusion, and separation, the human spirit still holds the ability to heal, to reconnect, and to rebuild. What was broken may never return to its original form, but it can still become something meaningful and strong in a new way. If this story has touched you in any way, if it made you think, reflect, or feel something deeper, we would truly appreciate your support. It only takes a simple click to like the video, share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing more meaningful stories like this to you. Once again, thank you for being here and for being part of this journey with us.